back to the Majority Report. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Nick Martin. He's a staff writer at Deadspin. He's author of the new series at Splinter News, State of the Nation. Nick, thanks so much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me, man.
So, Nick, you have a great piece, and people should read this piece. It's incredibly well written and researched. It will also make your stomach turn. Called How Jesse Helms Invented the Republican Party. First, let's just start with the bio, the facts of the case. Who was Jesse Helms? Who is his dad? In some ways, maybe more to the point, as you established in this article. And what was his career trajectory? Because what you really show is that obviously, I think everybody understood to the extent that they know who he was, that he was this retrograde, bigot, segregationist, and so on. But he was also a pioneer of media, which has obviously always been harnessed by the far right in this country and the Republican Party, and also, his father was a North Carolinian small town cop. So basically, every single negative social trend in one person. So maybe break that down for us.
Yeah, Jesse Helms, he's born in Monroe, North Carolina. It's a small town. Even before the 90s, North Carolina was pretty easy. You had, which were cities, I guess you call Charlotte and Raleigh, but the rest of it was either farming country, mountains, or small towns. And that's where you'd have factories and stuff like that. And that's where Jesse Helms grew up. It was obviously a segregated community. His dad was indeed a police chief as well as a fire chief in that community. And back in those days, even still, it holds a lot of power. And one of the things that I cite in the piece is that, his dad was not, the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. His dad was pretty routinely accused of physically abusing, black men and women in the community. And that's something that you can kind of tell rubbed off on Helms as he went through the rest of his life. From there, he always wanted to be a journalist in high school. That was what he said he wanted to do in his senior yearbook. And then he just kind of followed that career path. He first went to Wing It, and then he went Wing It University in North Carolina. Then he went to Wake Forest for a year. But he spent a lot of time working in Raleigh, doing the newspaper gigs, kind of learning the media machine from the inside. And so later on, after he worked on, some segregationist campaigns for Senate and president, he took that and he was able to bring it back to North Carolina and eventually got a show at WRAL. And this is an important thing to understand that, when I'm saying in the piece, I call it his show, it was a 5-minute editorial that would run every day. It was called Viewpoint. What that kind of was, I call it Fox News before it's Fox News because you have to remember this is time when you had 6 TV channels. My parents grew up in Eastern North Carolina, which is the main base, which was where his main base was located. And, that they grew up in the 70s and 80s, and that's what they had then. So you can imagine his show ran from 1960 to 1972, and he just really understood and developed an understanding of how to get people to line up with him, even though they might not necessarily be as extreme in their views as him. He made those views seem reasonable, I think, to people in a South that was resistant to change. Even North Carolina kind of has this reputation, or had this reputation of being a kind of a progressive beacon in the South. And it's kind of tough to square that sometimes when you actually go back and look at who they were producing in terms of the Helmses and the people that actually weren't just state leaders, but national leaders in this kind of new old South conservatism, I guess is the best way to put it.
So how did first just how did he make the pivot from journalism? How did he start? Because as you said, this TV show, these commentaries are really important. When did he start kind of formally stepping into this commentary role? And then maybe if you don't, actually just do that first. How did that shift start to happen?
Yeah, he had always been interested in doing that kind of stuff. it's just about, I don't think he had in his younger days, like he worked with the Will Smith campaign, and he did a lot of behind the scenes ad work while
Right.
not pretending, but he just had kind of fronted as being this journalist, and then on the backside, he was actually writing the ads and helping make sure they got, prime placement on the radio show he was doing. So it's just something that's kind of always been there for him, and he's just, as he went along in his career, people started to notice that he was good at that, and he just had more opportunities. So I would say a big thing that is not, even for people who know Jesse Helms and know the show Viewpoint, a big thing I would point out to would be his time running the Bankers Association, North Carolina Bankers Association. He did that for a number of years before he got his big show, and he had like a column there that was called By Jesse Helms, and he would just basically write takes, and he turned it into the biggest banking trade publication in the nation while he ran it, because they were just these anti-regulatory takes that he would dish out. And it was always there. I just think it was a matter of him kind of climbing that professional ladder to then be able to get to a spot where he could just reel them off every day.
Well, this is a really important point, and this is where your argument, and you make it. I think you're absolutely right. The synthesis between the interests of the corporate sector, banking as an example, and
right.
racism, segregation, cultural white supremacy, xenophobia, those are the twin pillars of the modern Republican Party. And what's interesting is that he so not only, I mean, people know, and we will continue to elaborate, but as I say, I think to the extent people are aware of who Jesse Helms is, it was the fact that, first of all, that the North Carolina kept sending him to the Senate through the aughts, right? And that you had this guy who was a overt, racist and apartheid advocate and so on. But that this other distinction is interesting. That and so on one hand you say, okay, yes, he comes out of the old, Dixiecrat, Jim Crow, segregationist tradition. Those guys were Democrats. Then they shifted and became Republicans with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 60s. So that's one part of the narrative. At the same time, some of those Dixiecrats, and to be clear, I mean, when they weren't defending, indentured servitude and a permanent racial underclass, which also did affect a lot of poor white people as well, because obviously things like poll taxes did affect, poor whites, even though it wasn't designed to target them in the same way. But that being said, you could find people who were segregationists and just despicable and retrograde on race, but they were they might have had some economic populist tendencies. They might have been supportive of New Deal programs for whites, essentially.
Yep.
Jesse Helms, how does the synthesis start where he pivots from the populism of economics and bridges the plutocracy economics with racism? Because that's, as I say, that is republicanism now. How does he start to bridge those things, and how does maybe bring us more towards the 70s and 80s as his influence really spans over the Republican Party, so that you can't understand someone like Ronald Reagan without understanding Jesse Helms?
Yeah, and that's something I didn't link to it or I linked to it, but I didn't quote this part. But like when he died, Ross Douthat wrote that if Jesse Helms' death is anything, it's like something to remember that we should have more Ronald Reagans and fewer Jesse Helms, and that's just completely ignoring that you cannot have Reagan without Helms. Like Helms was the guy kind of out front of the Republican Party when nobody really wanted to touch him. And then once he started making money, once people started understanding that his campaign methods worked well, then everybody was, or not everybody, but a lot of people, and especially behind closed doors, were very buddy-buddy with Helms as he progressed. Even somebody like Joe Biden came to his funeral.
Right.
And so I think that what you're talking about, he never really... There was never a time where he didn't have those kinds of tendencies in terms of his economic policy, the way that he approached it. Now, listen, a lot of his policy stuff through the 70s and 80s was more just being an oppositionist, just being somebody that would muck up the Senate with amendments and filibusters. But this stuff, I mean, the stuff about the way that, I mean, I quote it in there, the Atwater approach, the Lee Atwater approach.
Yep.
It's like that was Helms's thing the entire time. I mean, he went farther to the edge than I think a lot of other people did, and then it kind of allowed Republicans to obscure it by, he was one of the leading people against like force busting and stuff like that.
Right.
But it allowed them to obscure the economic policies to a point that like they were able, in a PR sense, to remove race from those conversations when it was still very clearly there. So for Helms, I'm not sure that he ever deviated from that path. It was more of a growing frustration within the Democratic Party that he felt. He always kind of saw the federal government as this very intrusive, kind of obnoxious figure in American life. I mean, he grew up, North Carolina is a state, you touched on this earlier. You just said about the stuff about how you might have a segregationist, but they might be more of, have populist economics.
Right.
Governor W. Kerr Scott, who was governor during the 1950 election then that I opened the piece with.
Right.
He's the guy who appointed Frank Porter Graham, the liberal UNC president. Frank Porter Graham was also a segregationist, but he also was a huge New Deal person because he grew up on farms in eastern North Carolina, and what the New Deal provided was subsidies for small family farmers they would kind of set a price floor so that they wouldn't fluctuate year to year. And so Helms was against those. Helms was against labor unions. Helms, like all this stuff that might have even helped poor whites, like Helms was against from basically the beginning. And you can read through his old interviews, and a place like the Southern Oral History Program has a really great, that I linked to it in the piece. Just read that. If you want to understand Helms's, where he's coming from economically, that's the best document because it's his words, and he's the same guy. Like, he's the same guy throughout, and I think the Republican Party adapted to him more than him adapting to the Republican Party. That's why he left the Democratic Party.
Definitely. So what we